Hello, Otto. It's Scharmer. Hi. Good morning there. You're in Boston now?
I am in Boston, yes.
Okay, great. It's lovely to see you here live, and we are here in Bilbao in the School of Humanities and Education Sciences of Mondragon University. These 2 days of global digital humanities. The second edition of the University with the C, where students have come together with practitioners and experts to trying to look at and explore at how to act locally to have an impact globally on the societal challenges that we face today, especially the young people who are coming out of universities, how to balance this challenge between the humanities and culture and the arts on one hand, the echo with the tech, science, and the governance challenges on the other hand, to try and bring these together. And this is a wonderful building called As Fabric, which is offspring of a European project conceived here. So we are trying to, in this building, combine these things together. So I'll just present yourself, Otto Scharmer, author of Stereo, co-author of the newly released Leading from the Emerging Future, From Ecosystem to Ecosystem Economies. Is an action researcher who co-creates innovations in learning and leadership that he delivers through classes and programs at MIT, MITx, the Presencing Institute, and through the ULab programs, the accelerator as the ULab 2X, and through innovation projects with organizations in business, government, and civil society around the world. Thank you for being here with us, and it's a real joy. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It would be lovely to see a camera on my screen from you guys, because I can't see really who is in the room. Okay, wonderful. Good to see you. And it would be good to keep the camera that way so that I can keep a little bit, at least, visual connection. I'm sorry that I cannot join you in person. Monica and I tried and didn't succeed due to my prior commitments here. We had the closing session of ULab yesterday, and but I'm really very happy to connect with you, to connect with Mondragon University, because as we all know, so we live in a moment of planetary crisis, and at the root of that crisis, it has everything, yes, to do with our economy, it has to do with our democracies, but essentially it has to do with our learning systems, right? And that way, what you all are doing, which is innovating learning and leadership towards planetary healing and societal transformation, that's really what I try to be in service of too. And I'm really interested in learning from you guys at Mondragon University and finding out ways how we can partner going forward. So what I thought, I know that I'm coming in at the tail end and all the main things have already happened. So, and I'm also lacking a little bit the context, of course. But what I thought I could do maybe before we move into conversational part, I could just share a little bit out of the work that I and colleagues here have been involved in lately, and then see how that resonates or not kind of with your own experiences. And so let me check kind of the audio, is that okay? And the visual, is that okay? All right. So I see one thumb up, and I assume that's speaking for everyone. This is an image by my colleague here in Cambridge, Kelvy Bird, that depicts a little bit our current moment, which is, as we all know, a moment of disruption where one civilization that is based on extraction is dying, right? That's kind of the current reality. And then another civilization is wanting to be born, which is a civilization that's based on regeneration and healing. And we know a lot about this one, what's broken here. We know a little less about, what this really could look like, but we know some. But what we know least about is the journey from here to here. It's kind of how to respond to a challenge of disruption in a way that's really operating from the emerging future and not just reacting as an extension of the past. And that really, how to do that, that question has been organizing my own journey, kind of my own quest, my own work as an action researcher. And basically, the perspective that we are taking on answering that question from a theory U point of view is that what it takes is a journey. And it's a journey that both is an outer journey and an inner journey. And that's basically what we describe, through this U process. I think you had Mile Boyer earlier in with a keynote, and so you probably are, or some of you may be already familiar with that to some degree. Maybe to just give one more data point also to what really is the current situation. Recently, there was a survey, it's just a few months old, I think, in the G20 countries. So the G20 countries represent 60%, 60, of the global population and 80% of the global GDP. So in that survey, people were asked how much or whether or not they're in support of transforming the current economic and social system in order to better address the ecological and social crisis that we are living in. And it turns out that 3 out of 4 of the people polled are in support of that. So 75% of the people in the G20 countries are in support of profound transformation of our social and economic system. And of course, what's not happening? Exactly that. So that is, in a nutshell, I think our current situation. There's a huge potential for profound transformation and even an aspiration to do so. But most people then would also say, if you ask that question, but I don't know how. And that's really what I want to address, kind of the how part, which is kind of the part that has to do kind of with this journey here. So a word to my own background. I went from Europe to here to Boston, MIT, some 25 years ago, because I wanted to learn more about systems thinking. And as you all know, systems thinking starts really with a very simple distinction between symptoms at the top, right, what's visible above the waterline, and then root issues below the waterline. And these 4 words, structures, or 3 kind of concepts here, structures, paradigms of thought, and source, in a nutshell, show you the evolution of systems thinking over the past maybe 50 years or so. And what I want to share with you is a view of systems thinking that is really integrating all 4 of these levels. So basically what I'm saying is, in order to accomplish real systems change, what many people aspire to do today, we really need to address all 4 of these levels. And that's something that and my colleagues here call awareness-based systems change, or you could also say a consciousness-based systems change. And it's based on the following four principles. One, you cannot understand a system unless you change it. Kurt Lewin famously, when in the 1930s, after Hitler took power, he, went from Berlin to the U.S. East Coast in order to found what today is known as action learning and action research. And so that's one of his founding principles. You cannot understand a system unless you change it. In other words, you really need to, as a researcher, get involved yourself. Otherwise, you're not accessing the real knowledge that is at issue today. Number two, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. So that's basically summarizing my past 20 years as an action researcher, right? So you cannot change a system unless you change the mindset of the people who are enacting these systems. In other words, if you want to change a system, you need to address all four of these levels, not just the first two, okay? So it's 20 years of experience summarized in less than 10 words, but it may also resonate with your own experience because if we only change structure and process, but not the mindset based on which people operate, then often what we see is the same people enacting the same problems just in a new structure. So let's just assume that to be true. Then the real question is, number three, how? How do we do that? And what we learned there is this. You can't transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. And I want to underline this one here, the sensing. Because traditionally in systems thinking, you would have said, unless you make a system see itself, right? But what we learned is, when you only make the system see itself, okay, I see what's broken with you, right? That not necessarily is unlocking the deeper capacities of collective creativity. So unless I feel the pain that someone else is feeling in my system, right? Unless I activate the knowing of the heart, we are very unlikely to unlock the deeper sources of collective creativity in a system. So that's where kind of a lot of the social arts and really the deeper levels of listening and empathy and human connection comes into play. And then lastly, you can't lead a system, you can't lead systems change unless you sense and actualize the future as it emerges. And that really goes to what I would propose as a deepened understanding or a systems thinking based understanding of leadership. If you double click on the word root of the English word leadership, it goes back to an Indo-European word root, and the original meaning is stepping forth. Right? It's light. So it's the word is light, the Indo-European word root. It literally means to step forth, to step from one world that we know very well into another world that we don't know very well. And that will only coming into being if we have the courage to step into the unknown. So that's basically where we are, and that's an overview kind of the methodology that I'm trying to address the question that I mentioned. So what is it, what we learned? And one of the, in listening to practitioners and working with practitioners, so one of the key things that I picked up early on is this. So this is that there is a deeper process of learning and leadership that often gets overlooked. And in this case, it's the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien, who articulated this deeper dimension with the following sentence. Reflecting on his many years of leading transformational change as a CEO, he said, "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. In other words, the success of what I do as a change maker depends on the inner place from that I operate. And when I heard that, I thought, so it was really like an eye opener for me, because I thought, well, we know everything about what leaders do and change makers. We know a lot about the how, the process dimension, but what do we know about the source dimensions, kind of the inner place, the interior condition from which leaders and change makers operate? Very little. And today, I would describe this inner place in terms of these three capacities: open mind, open heart, and open will, aka curiosity, compassion, and courage. And what these capacities really do is this: move us beyond downloading. Downloading means same old, kind of we are inside of our individual and collective bubble of habitualized behavior. So that's what it's really moving us out of. And open mind, in essence, really is the capacity to suspend old habits of judgment and to see with fresh eyes. Open heart really means to empathize, which means to look at a problem, not from your angle, but through the eyes of your stakeholder, right? That's what we mean, kind of to sense a system. And then open will really is the capacity to let go and let come, right? Let go of the old and let come of the new. So that's basically what we originally referred to as theory U. But now, if you look around and ask yourself, okay, and what has happened in the world the past 5+ or so years, and what we see is pretty much the opposite, right? Pretty much the opposite of everything I just talked about, which is not an opening of the mind, heart, will, but a freeze reaction of the mind, heart, will, aka ignorance, bias, hate, cynicism, fear, fanaticism. So instead of seeing, what do we see? Denial, which is not seeing. Instead of sensing, really looking at an issue through someone else's eyes, we have desensing, right? Getting stuck inside our own filter bubbles. Instead of letting go and presencing, we have holding on and absencing, disconnecting to from our highest future possibility. And instead of bringing the new into reality, what we see is these kinds of collective patterns, unintentionally often, right? Blaming, destruction, and eventually self-destruction, right? Destruction of nature, of relationships, of trust, of institutions, and eventually of ourselves. So what I'm basically saying is this. All right, so if no one knows how the future is going to play out, but there's one thing we pretty much know almost for sure, and that is disruption is going to go up, not to go down. So most people feel like COVID is just the beginning of something, right? So disruption is going to stay. So we better learn how to deal with disruption in this century, in this decade. So if we are hit by a challenge of disruption, we can either respond by turning away or turning toward, right? And turning away is activating a process that eventually results in destruction and self-destruction, and that we all know pretty well, by now, all know pretty well. And, when we turn towards, we activate a different kind of process that we also know quite well from our own experiences, because we all have experiences of this kind as well. So basically, as human beings, right? So, and as disruptions go up, we are kind of in this in-between space here, right? So sometimes we respond this way, sometimes we respond this way. Sometimes on an interpersonal level, we move into this space. Sometimes on a collective level, we still enact that. So that's a little bit the challenge that we have. So I believe today as a change maker, it's not good enough just to focus on this side. we also need to focus on how to transform this side, because that's where a lot of energy is residing in our systems. So the real question in this century, I believe, is how do we transform and regenerate? And that's that has to do with becoming aware of our own blind spots. And I think they're like in leadership today and in change making in all institutions, all Western institutions for sure. We have like these three blind spots: not seeing, not feeling, and not acting. It's basically not seeing is the disconnect between self and world, right? Between what's really going on. Think about all the patterns of denial that we currently see. Not feeling is, I see what the problem is. I see, say, systemic racism, other things, but I'm not feeling it, right? I'm not empathizing with the people on the other side of the divide, right? Desensing and hate, or simply cynicism are also examples there. And then not acting is, I aspire to do something, right? I see, I sense something, but I can't mobilize my own agency. And that has to do with depression, apathy, and fear, which is a huge issue, as we all know. So what is the transformative healing ingredient here? We need to cross these divides, right? And that's basically by deepening our listening, by deepening our sensing, and also by activating our own agency. So it's basically moving beyond these divides. I think that's kind of what the container conditions are. Can you listen with humility, right? Kind of that's, I think, the foundation of really transforming this one here, right? Can you sense a system from the edges, the system? So who are the excluded in your system? And can you sense it from the edges? That's really transforming this one over here, right? Because democracy is challenged by architectures of separation. Think about Facebook today. We need to create architectures of connection here. And that's kind of allows us to bring down these walls. And then the most important wall is maybe between me and myself, me and my capital S self, which is my highest future possibility. Can you sense and step into the future as it emerges? Kind of, can you sense the highest future possibilities that depend on you in order to bring it into reality? So that's, I think, the inner leadership work that we need to develop, and that we need to create learning spaces around in this century. And of course, I'm talking to you now, right, on a personal level, but of course there is a societal dimension also to it, which basically has to do with innovations and infrastructures to upgrade and transform our own economy from revolving around ecosystem awareness to revolving around ecosystem awareness, upgrading and evolving our democratic infrastructures to make them more distributed, dialogic, direct, and of course, evolving and transforming our own learning and leadership infrastructures towards whole person, whole systems learning. All right, what does that look like, right? So how do we really do that? And without, given the time, so I can't go too much into detail here, but let me just say, as some of you may already be familiar with, going through something like the U process involves basically, clarifying the shared intention, doing a lot of kind of learning journeys, kind of where you walk in each other's shoes, then have deep sense-making, a sense-making deep dive where you connect all of that, what you learn, kind of with your deeper levels of aspiration and the whole core team. And then you crystallize ideas that you explore by doing, right? You explore the future by doing through rapid cycle prototyping, and then you scale kind of what you have been learning across the system. So what it basically is, it's a process that not only creates practical outcomes, but it's a process that maybe on a most important level is allowing us to shift the way we relate to the system. So basically, the mindset shift is kind of from seeing the system out there towards bending the beam of observation back onto the observing self. So becoming aware of how I contribute to the problem at hand, right? And if that happens on an individual level, we call that mindfulness, or we call that reflection. If that happens, say, in a group conversation, we call that a shift from debate to dialogue. Dialogue is not just people talking to each other. Dialogue is the capacity of a system to see itself, kind of to go through this kind of procedure. So essentially, when I look at my work with organizations and with larger systems, that's really what you are paid for at the end of the day. As a systems facilitator or as a leader working with systems thinking tools, what you are being paid for at the end of the day is to help systems to go through this procedure, right? To make them see themselves and sense themselves on the level of the collective. So that's a very important function, because otherwise you cannot shift consciousness from ego to eco. Kind of that's where the shift of consciousness is actually happening. And when you don't have the tools to do that, it is not happening. Okay? So I want to show you, therefore, a few examples where that actually is happening. And it's sometimes really quite easy. So it may be quite replicable and applicable for a context you're already involved in. So this is an organization. It's the biggest fintech in the world and financial, more than 800 million users. Many of them in China, but also many hundred of millions of users outside of China. So they became aware of that. They have so the CEO told me, okay, so we have brilliant people, right? Graduates from Stanford, MIT, blah, blah, blah. They are brilliant in their own area of responsibility, but our collective IQ, he said, is pretty low, okay? So you have a leader of highly talented individual, a leadership team of highly talented individuals, but the collective IQ is really low. Can you help us? So in this case, what we did is a little bit of deep listening training. That's not more than an hour or so. It was kind of pretty light, but it basically kind of teaching a little bit how to listen to another person. And then they did an ecosystem mapping of all their stakeholders in 2 Southeast Asian countries, right? So all the way from the regulators to their partners, to their customers, to the unbanked people with no financial means. And then they took 2 days. So 15 people went to country A, the other 15 people went to country B. They split up in groups of 3 or 4. And they were just listening to all these stakeholders from morning to evening, all right? Not explaining stuff to them, just listening. And then on day 3 and 4, both of these teams came back together in Singapore, and that's where the picture is taken from, and then shared everything with each other, what they learned. And what was so interesting is that the whole way they had a conversation, shifted, right, from debate to dialogue and more collective thinking and problem solving. The way they saw their own role in the system had shifted because they had experienced the impact their decision making had as a global leadership team, on all these stakeholders. Whom they had been partially unaware of prior to that. So this is basically a 4-day intervention that with the top 30 people of a big company that basically helped them to see their own system through the eyes of all of their whole ecosystem of stakeholders. Okay? So it's it's not very complicated, really. It's just kind of listening with your mind and heart open to all of them, and then sharing with each other kind of what results from that. So example one. Example two is, this is another tool. This is kind of a process working on food deserts in Sao Paulo, involving more than 30 different organizations and more than 100 individuals. And as you can see here, it happens on many tables, right? You have kind of tables where people map the system and then the emerging next system, and and they share then what their own experience around that and their own view through the eyes of all the participating stakeholders. A third example is something we call 4D mapping, and that is, some of you may be familiar with constellation work, so it's kind of a blend between, you could say, constellation, social science, stakeholder mapping, and mindfulness, right? And so, for example, you have all the usual suspects in a multi-stakeholder arrangement. This is kind of the CTI, is one of the biggest multi-stakeholder processes worldwide, but so it's, you have all the traditional, but this person, for example, he is the head of HR in the biggest bank in Indonesia, but his role here is that of Mother Earth, okay? So you have Mother Earth to bring in the ecological divide, basically. You have all the marginalized groups to bring in the social divide, and then you bring in the voice of the future somehow, often with the voice of children or so, or future generations, in order to put the stakeholder mapping in a context where the full dimension of the ecological, social, and also the spiritual dimension of the crisis is being made explicit by bringing these voices in. And again, it's a pretty reliable process that you put it, you need to wrap it into like a half-day workshop or so, but it makes, in a very reliable way, I have it used quite often with leadership teams, because in a very reliable way, it makes the system sense and see itself, and it creates a language for some of the deeper dynamics that are often hidden from the eye and that prevent the system to go through a real process of transformation. For example, becoming aware of who is excluded, and a whole bunch of other dynamics that are often difficult to talk about if you don't have the right kind of language. So all this stuff we also used in, and increasingly are using, also in very traditional environments. So here we have worked with hundreds, if not thousands of leaders in the UN system this year, with, in 16 different countries, SDG leadership labs, and then we had an action learning lab that involved 350 leaders from more than 8 agencies, across many locations. So it's pretty much the same process, but in this case, it's focused on implementing and realizing the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also did some experimentation about, okay, can you really bring that to scale? Because if you look at the planetary crisis we live in, can we really make these deeper transformative learning environments available to many more people? And that's where ULab, which is basically a class I teach here at MIT, and that some of you I know have participated in, where we put that on. It's basically, you can think about it simply as a radical decentralization of the classroom, right? Basically by handing over all the tools, and then in your own local environment, you create your own classroom, your own group, and then, but you're part of a global community doing that. So you do go through these steps together. So 200,000 sounds like a lot. Of course, in reality, it's not that many who finish this, but that's the number of registered participants, and it did activate a global ecosystem, right? So of change. So that's part of a larger movement. So we had yesterday a closing session of ULab 1X this year. And this is, so in terms of the mindset shift, some of that, so the yellow is after ULAB. The blue is at the beginning of ULAB 3 months ago. And then on the relational dimension, right, you have somewhat more significant shift, right, kind of increase of capacity. But interestingly, the most significant shift that happened over the last 3 months is in terms of action confidence. And in terms of overcoming the doubt, right, that maybe it's already too late, maybe everything is going to happen. I mean, this whole culture of depression and of anxiety and also of doubt, right? Yeah, I know something profoundly different needed to happen. Maybe it could happen, but can we really? And that's, of course, a big part of the current culture. And that's where I think we have really a role. So in wrapping up, systems thinking, what does it mean across these domains? I think what I have seen, and I don't know how that relate with your own experience, but basically that we move in many different systems through the same shifts, right? You can think of them in terms of operating system, from input and authority centric, that was the past, to output and efficiency centric, that's the mainstream today, to outcome and user centric, that are the good systems today, and this is the emerging future, regenerative and ecosystem centric. So in health and learning, it's evidence-based medicine, testing driven teaching, towards patient-centric medicine and student-centric learning architectures. And then, in the 4.0, it would be strengthening the source of well-being, right? That's not just, patient-centric medicine with all the same, just fighting the symptoms of pathology, but really strengthening the sources of well-being. And this is kind of about whole person, whole systems learning, head, heart, and hand. In agriculture, right, kind of from industrial agriculture to organic, okay, that's better because it's reduce a negative footprint. But what we really need is regenerative agriculture, food as medium for healing planet and people. And the same can be said to finance, right? So yes, extractive capital, Wall Street. We try to move towards impact investing, ESG, all these things. That's less of the bad things. That's good. But what we really need is regenerative capital, focusing on transforming the deeper systems and being fully externality aware. The development paradigm, right, still GDP centric today, even though since 1990 we have the human development, the HDI, right, published by the UNDP. And then last December, we moved really from a human well-being centric way of measuring to human and planetary well-being centric framework with the most recent Human Development Report. And, governance, of course, it's kind of from the visible hand to the invisible hand to basically lobbying, right? Organized interest groups. That's what we have today, right? And that's what's not solving our problem. So I think what we need is this awareness-based collective action as a way of really bringing the multiple stakeholders together and going through them with a methodical process that I indicated with some examples earlier. I think that's what we see more and more happening. Where do we see that first? Locally. And that's why what you have been discussing the last 2 days is so critical, right? Because this 4.0 governance, which really is maybe the most important happening on the planet right now, is something that happens first locally. And why locally? Because that's where the commons are obvious to everyone. It's like common sense to organize around them. If the commons are global, less visible, I'm more likely to stick with my ego behavior. So let me, in closing, what I try to say is this: planetary healing and civilizational regeneration. That's what we try to do in this decade, in this century, right? I believe the only way of doing that is by doing this, activating generative social fields, right? Moving stakeholder relationships from toxic to co-creative. So this is a picture taking from a 2X team, I think, in Brazil. Right? In complex systems, really activating co-creativity, kind of the generative social fields. And if that's what we all work on, one way or another, I think. And if we have learned anything in how to do that over the past half century, what is that? It's this. You cannot do that without a support structure. That's what we call school for transformation, right? You can call it anything, but if you don't have a support structure, you're not going to transform the old patterns of behavior towards different patterns. And that's really, I think, what needs more focus. And that's what I believe is the role of universities in society. That's why we have such a thing like higher ed, like universities. In order to truly democratize access to transformation literacy. And I don't know, Monica, but the next time, I mean, if we talk about, we could go a little bit more into detail, kind of how to do that and what are specific components of such a school for transformation and how to collaborate that maybe between what we do over here and what you do in your own context in a more intentional way. But that's pretty much what I wanted to share.